Life on the ranch had always been about space, quiet, and control. When someone bought land in the countryside, they did so for peace. The kind of peace that came from being away from the bustle of towns and the endless grind of neighborhoods overseen by homeowners' associations. For years, the ranch sat comfortably on the edge of Willow Creek, its wooden fences, sprawling pastures, and iron gate marking a clear line. This was private property, and it wasn't up for negotiation. That peace, however, never lasts forever when someone like Karen enters the picture. Karen was not just any neighbor. She was the kind of woman who thrived on bending rules and then playing the victim when someone dared to enforce them. She wasn't even a rancher. She lived in the nearby HOA-controlled subdivision, the one that prided itself on freshly painted fences, uniform lawns, and bylaws thick enough to rival a legal textbook. Her house stood at the very back of the neighborhood, pressed against the boundary line where the subdivision ended and open ranch land began. And that was where the trouble started. Karen had discovered, much to her delight, that my ranch road, a private gravel path cutting through my property, was a faster route into town. Instead of winding through the subdivision's narrow streets and waiting at the main exit, she could shave off 5 minutes by driving straight across my land and out my gate. 5 minutes was apparently worth trespassing, worth ignoring posted signs, and worth tearing up a road not designed for constant SUV traffic. At first, I thought it was a one-off mistake. Ranch gates sometimes look like service roads, and maybe she didn't realize. But then I noticed the pattern. The gate would be left ajar when it should have been shut. Gravel ruts deepened with each pass of her tires. Dust clouds rolled behind her shiny SUV, as if she were entitled to treat my property like a public thoroughfare. I tried to fix it the simple way. Signs went up. Private property. No trespassing. I even reinforced the gate with a chain and lock. For a brief moment it worked, but then the chain turned up snapped, the lock broken as if someone believed rules simply didn't apply. That someone, of course, was Karen. Her reasoning became clear through whispers in town. She had told neighbors that the ranch road was practically public anyway, and that it was unfair for me to hog all that land. To her, a shortcut wasn't just convenient, it was her right. And when confronted, she doubled down, insisting that my gate was blocking community access, even though the community had never used it until she decided it was hers for the taking. Each time her SUV rolled through, it chipped away at more than gravel. It chipped away at the sense of safety and respect that private property should guarantee. I found tire tracks weaving dangerously close to my pastures, spooking livestock. I found wrappers and discarded coffee cups tossed from her window, litter that never belonged in the dirt of a working ranch. And worse yet, I knew that the more she got away with it, the bolder she would become. So I tried warnings. I caught her once at the gate and told her directly that this was my land and my road, not her shortcut. She laughed, waved me off, and drove on like I was some hired hand standing in her way. Another time I left a note on her windshield, a polite but firm reminder of the law. She crumpled it up and tossed it onto my gravel before speeding away. That's when frustration hardened into resolve. Karen wasn't just ignoring me. She was challenging me, daring me to stop her. And in a place like Willow Creek, where people respected property lines like sacred boundaries, that was more than a nuisance. It was a violation. I knew if I let it go, others might follow. My ranch road could turn into a community driveway, and the land I'd worked so hard to maintain would be treated like nothing more than pavement for impatient drivers. Something had to change. I began to study her habits. Karen drove through like clockwork in the mornings and evenings, always at the same times, always with the same arrogance. She would slow just enough at the gate to make sure it wasn't blocked, then roar through, gravel spitting out behind her tires. She never imagined that the rancher she dismissed so easily was watching, planning, waiting for the moment she would meet a trap she'd never forget. The plan started simple, but grew in layers. I wouldn't confront her anymore. Confrontations gave her excuses, gave her drama to spin in her favor. No, what I wanted was undeniable proof of her disregard, and a consequence that would make her think twice the next time she treated someone else's property like her own. Out on the ranch, We learned to solve problems with equal parts patience and grit. Karen thought she had found a loophole, a weak spot in the fence she could exploit without consequence. But she was about to learn what happened when someone mistook kindness for weakness, and when the trap was finally set, it wouldn't just be Karen's arrogance on display. It would be her SUV, stuck, scraped, and humbled, right there at the gate she had never respected. The stage was set, and all I had to do was wait. Once the decision was made, there was no going back. The quiet frustration that had brewed inside me for weeks finally hardened into determination. Karen had ignored every polite warning, every posted sign, every locked chain. She had pushed through all barriers without hesitation, and in her mind, she had already won. What she didn't know was that each careless pass of her SUV only tightened the noose of her own downfall. The key to any good trap was subtlety. It couldn't be obvious, couldn't be something she would notice before it was too late. If I put up a concrete barrier or blocked the road entirely, she would just claim I had escalated things, and the HOA board would likely rally to her defense. That was their style, defend their own, even when they were in the wrong. I needed something smarter, something she couldn't spin into a narrative of victimhood. So I started with observation. Her SUV wasn't built for ranch roads. Shiny, oversized tires that were more for show than for work. A gleaming paint job that hadn't seen real dirt until she forced it onto mine. She drove too fast always, her arrogance betraying her. She never once slowed enough to scan the road ahead. That I realized would be her weakness. She expected everything to remain as predictable as the manicured streets of her subdivision. The ranch road, though belonged to me, and on my land, predictability was a choice. The first step was reinforcement. I replaced the old gate with a sturdier frame. Wider posts, heavier hinges, a steel crossbar hidden just behind the wooden slats. It looked rustic and unassuming on the outside, but the bones of it were solid, built to withstand more than just casual pressure. If Karen thought she could simply nudge it open with her SUV's bumper again, she was in for a surprise. Then came the second layer. Just beyond the gate, a shallow trench carved across the gravel. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a rut caused by rain or erosion. But I had dug it clean, measured it just enough so that when a heavy vehicle passed over at speed, the suspension would dip hard and scrape the undercarriage. It wouldn't cause catastrophic damage, not yet, but it would rattle the arrogance right out of her steering wheel. The final touch was the deterrent she would never see until it was too late. A hidden row of caltrops, crafted from welded rebar and sharpened to a cruel point. I placed them carefully in the dirt along the edges of the path where a reckless driver might veer to avoid the trench. Not directly in the center, no, that would be too obvious. Just tucked off to the sides, waiting for a wheel to catch them. A tire blown on gravel wouldn't be easy to excuse away as bad luck. It would look and feel like the consequence of arrogance. Each layer of the trap had been designed with purpose. I didn't want to harm Karen herself, just her sense of invincibility. I wanted her SUV to limp back to the subdivision in shame, its tires deflated, its paint scratched, its suspension groaning. I wanted her to finally understand that this road wasn't hers, this land wasn't hers, and no amount of HOA entitlement could change that. But traps were only as good as the timing. And timing required patience, so I waited. The first few days after the setup, Karen didn't come. Perhaps she was busy, perhaps she was taking the longer way around out of spite, or perhaps she simply didn't have anywhere to be. Each morning and evening I stood by the barn, eyes trained on the gate, waiting for that familiar cloud of dust. But the road remained empty. It was almost as if she knew something had changed. Then, just when I began to wonder if my work had been wasted, the sound came. Gravel crunching beneath oversized tires, the faint hum of an engine straining with unnecessary speed. And then, through the trees, the flash of sunlight off her SUV's chrome grille. Karen was back. She slowed at the gate, as always, her arrogance telling her it would yield with the slightest push. But this time, when her bumper nudged forward, the steel reinforcement held fast. The SUV jolted, and I could almost imagine her scowl deepening behind the tinted glass. She reversed, pressed harder, and the sound of metal against metal rang out across the quiet field. The gate refused to budge. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. With a sudden surge, she forced her way through, this time with enough speed to rattle the hinges and splinter a corner of the wood. She had made it through, but not without consequence. Her victory would be short-lived. The trench came next. She hit it at full speed, her tires bouncing down into the rut with a bone-jarring crash. The SUV's undercarriage scraped hard, the sound carrying through the still evening air like a scream of metal against stone. Dust exploded behind her as she jerked the wheel, veering slightly to avoid the deeper edge of the cut. That was her second mistake. The right side tire caught the caltrops, sharp steel tearing into rubber like a knife through cloth. The hiss of air escaping the tire was immediate, followed by the wobble of a vehicle that had just lost its footing. She tried to correct, overcompensating with the wheel, but the left rear tire struck another hidden spike. In an instant, the SUV sagged awkwardly, its proud stance deflated into a lopsided crawl. Karen had made it onto my land, yes, but now she was stranded, humiliated, her shortcut turned into a trap she could no longer escape. From my vantage point at the barn, I watched in silence. The trap had worked exactly as intended. Her arrogance had blinded her to every warning, every sign, every layer of protection. Now her prized SUV sat crippled in the gravel, and there was no one she could blame but herself. And yet, knowing Karen, blame would never be something she took willingly. If I had learned anything from dealing with her kind, it was that the fallout would be louder, messier, and far more dramatic than the act itself. Because while the trap had been sprung, the real story was only just beginning. The trap had done its job. Karen's gleaming SUV sat crippled just beyond my reinforced gate, its right side sagging, tires shredded by the hidden steel beneath the gravel. The once pristine vehicle, her symbol of power and superiority, now looked awkward and vulnerable, leaning into the dirt as if the land itself had swallowed her pride whole. For a moment the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hiss of escaping air from the ruined tires. From the barn, I stayed still, my arms folded, eyes fixed on the scene. I knew her type too well to expect humility. She wouldn't take this as a lesson learned. She wouldn't drive away quietly or admit she had no right to use the road. No, Karen would do what Karens always did. She would escalate. And escalate she did. By the next day, whispers ran through the subdivision like wildfire. The story twisted as it traveled, told and retold, until it no longer resembled the truth. According to Karen, I had set a dangerous and illegal trap meant to cause her harm. She described the spikes as if they were weapons, claiming I had plotted against her safety. She told neighbors that she had been left stranded in the middle of nowhere, without help, ignoring the fact that she had been less than a quarter-mile from her own backyard. She painted herself as a victim, her SUV as collateral damage in some imagined feud. It didn't take long for the HOA board to rally behind her. They always did. These were people who believed rules were flexible when applied to themselves, but absolute when applied to others. They called it community solidarity, but what it really meant was protecting their own, even when their own had trespassed, broken property, and ignored every warning. I could see the shift in the way people looked at me in town. Whispers followed me at the hardware store. Sideways glances trailed me at the diner. The story Karen spread was gaining traction, and the HOA machine was fueling it with every meeting, every letter, every self-righteous phone call to officials who didn't care enough to look deeper. The next move came quickly. A pair of sheriff's deputies arrived at my gate, their vehicles pulling into the same gravel that Karen had once treated as her personal driveway. They had received a complaint, they said, about dangerous obstructions on a public road. Public road. That was Karen's new angle. She was insisting that my private ranch gate and gravel path weren't mine at all, but part of a long-forgotten easement that gave community access. It was a bold claim, but boldness had never been her weakness. It was her strength, twisted into entitlement. Fortunately, the law was still on my side. I showed the deputies my deed, my property lines, the clearly marked signs and photographs documenting the damage she had caused over time. The gate wasn't public. The road wasn't shared. This land was mine, and the law backed it. The deputies left without further action, but I could see it in their faces. The complaint had been ridiculous. But it wasn't the last they would hear of it. Karen, however, wasn't satisfied with the law's indifference. The very next week, the HOA held an emergency meeting, one conveniently scheduled and loudly announced. Word spread fast that the rancher at the edge of Willow Creek was endangering community members. They painted me as a recluse, someone hostile to the neighborhood's needs, and accused me of using vigilante tactics against innocent residents. I wasn't invited to speak, of course. I wasn't even part of their subdivision, but my name filled the room, carried on Karen's exaggerated retelling of events. To hear her say it, she had been nearly trapped inside a collapsing vehicle, forced to call for rescue as her life hung in the balance. She left out the part about trespassing. She left out the broken locks and busted chains. She left out the arrogance. By the end of that meeting, the HOA had voted to formally petition for access to my road. They wanted to force an easement, to strip me of control over the gate and open it for their use. It was laughable, legally flimsy at best, but it showed just how far they were willing to go. Karen's humiliation had sparked a crusade. The following days brought a flurry of letters, some from the HOA, others from their lawyers, each one a demand wrapped in pseudo-legal language. Each one claiming rights that didn't exist. They arrived in my mailbox like clockwork, stacked higher each week, until the pile became a symbol of their persistence. But the more they tried to pressure me, the more resolute I became. This was my land, my gate, my choice. Meanwhile, Karen paraded her damaged SUV as if it were evidence of some crime. She parked it in her driveway, deflated tires still mounted, scratches left unbuffed, like a trophy to rally sympathy. Neighbors gathered around it in the evenings, shaking their heads, tutting under their breath, reinforcing the narrative she had spun. She had turned her failure into theater, and the HOA was her audience. But there was one thing Karen hadn't considered. A trap set on my property wasn't illegal, and while she played her victim role, I had the truth and evidence on my side. Photos of her tire tracks, the broken chains, the countless times she had ignored posted signs. She wanted to escalate? Fine, I could escalate too. As I prepared my next move, I realized that this was no longer about Karen alone. She had dragged the entire HOA into the fight, and now it wasn't just a battle over a shortcut. It was a battle over principle, control, and respect. She thought she had cornered me with her lies and her boardroom theatrics, but she hadn't seen the full measure of what I was willing to do. The trap had sprung, and it had left scars, not just on her SUV but on her pride. Now the fallout was spreading and the fight was only heating up. The storm was coming, and I was ready to meet it head-on. The quiet fight over a gravel road had metastasized into a bureaucratic war. What began as a personal vendetta, an entitled neighbor using private land as her shortcut, had swollen into letters from lawyers, petitions, and the kind of formal paperwork that makes small-town drama feel official. Karen had convinced the HOA to take up her cause, and the HOA had convinced itself that collective outrage could overturn deeds and surveys. Now everyone had lawyers, and everyone believed the truth could be bent with the right stationery. The HOA's first legal volley was theatrical and thin. A demand letter arrived, heavy with legalese and threats, insisting that the rancher cease and desist from obstructing a public right-of-way. The envelope smelled like litigation and confidence. Attached were signatures from residents claiming historical use, affidavits drafted to sound formal, and a petition asserting that the path had been used by residents for decades. In their telling, the gravel road was a forgotten communal artery, and the gate an intolerable blockade. Where they saw righteousness, I saw opportunism. Where they saw a collective right, I saw a coordinated attempt to force access so convenience could trump ownership. Yet the letters demanded a response, and ignoring them would be a mistake. So I assembled my own set of papers, deeds, a survey done the year the property was purchased, photographs with timestamps, and a consistent log I'd kept since the first tire tracks appeared. Each page was a brick in the wall I was building against their narrative. Evidence mattered. In disputes like this, memory was cheap, and records were currency. I hired a surveyor to restake property lines and produce an official map that left no room for reinterpretation. The surveyor walked the same ground the county records described, and when the final plat arrived, it was clean, crisp, and unambiguous. My gate, my road, my property. I had the legal description etched into a professional report that would be hard to dismiss. I also leaned into time-stamped proof. I had kept a camera trained on the gate, initially out of frustration, then out of necessity. The footage showed a pattern. The same SUV, the same times, the same cavalier disregard for posted signs. Each clip was labeled and dated, each violation a line item in a chronology of trespass. I printed stills, enlarged tire tracks, highlighted crushed locks and tossed litter. The physical evidence was undeniable. Then there were the witness statements. Not from activists or people angling for drama, but from neighbors who respected property and from farmhands who worked the land. The testimony came from folks who had seen the SUV barrel through at dawn and dusk, who had seen livestock spooked by a sudden pass-through, who had found broken gates and ripped hinges. Their words were simple and factual. They did not attempt to spin a story of heroism for me or martyrdom for Karen. They merely confirmed the truth that had unfolded day after day. When the HOA escalated to the county, filing for a prescriptive easement claim and seeking a declaratory judgment that a right-of-way existed, the legal back and forth intensified. Their filings referenced historical use and community necessity. My response referenced deeds, plats, and the chain of title. Legal arguments filled pages, but beneath the rhetoric was a clearer conflict. Convenience versus ownership. Entitlement versus boundaries. Karen and her allies tried to paint me as a stubborn landlord hiding behind paperwork. They staged photographs with carefully placed children playing near the gate, as if the presence of people somehow converted private lanes into communal ways. It was theater, crafted and calculated. But theater does not replace documents. It does not replace a deed recorded at the county clerk's office, nor the detailed notes of a licensed surveyor. The county hearing that followed was predictably tense. Neighbors filed in like jurors of social opinion, and the HOA's representatives presented their case with confident declarations and a stack of neighbor-signed petitions. Karen fronted the parade, her mangled SUV's image circulating in the community like a badge of honor. She spoke. Her voice was everywhere through emails and calls, about safety and access, about how one gate could supposedly shut out a whole neighborhood. But the official record favored substance. The hearing officer scrutinized the deeds, the survey, the maps that showed an unmistakable line between the subdivision and the ranch. Tests were requested. The county asked for more documentation and set a tight timetable for responses. It was the kind of procedural choreography designed to winnow out weak claims. The HOA had momentum, the county had rules. The ranch had facts. Public sentiment swayed under pressure. Social media amplified every side, and people who had never set foot on the gravel felt compelled to pick a team. I had underestimated how quickly local drama could become digital spectacle. My surveillance clips circulated, anonymously posted at first, then linked in neighborhood forums. The footage of repeated trespass, of her SUV barreling through despite posted signs and locked chains, soured the narrative the HOA had tried to cultivate. People who'd been tempted to side with convenience found themselves seeing the repeated disregard for private property. Still, the legal dance required more than public opinion. I retained counsel versed in property disputes, someone who understood how to translate deeds into legal armor. My lawyer filed the necessary motions, presented the surveyor's report, and articulated a defense that rested not on drama but on doctrine. Recorded title, uninterrupted ownership, and the absence of any legal prescriptive easement. The firm's letters were crisp and unambiguous, less theatrical than the HOA's proclamations but more effective in court. Sensing the tide turn, the HOA tried a final gambit, threatening to flood the issue into the public domain with complaints to every county office, to the state's land use board, to anyone who would lend bureaucratic weight to their claim. They took photographs, drafted petitions, and sought sympathetic press. But with every new complaint they filed, my stack of official documents grew thicker. Each new allegation simply invited another copy of the survey or another time-stamped photo. The result was not an immediate victory, but a grinding, bureaucratic stalemate that favored records over rhetoric. The county paused the HOA's attempt to force access pending further legal review, And that pause felt like a victory in itself. It bought time. Time to lay out the facts in a way that could not be shouted down in a meeting room or drowned out by social media noise. In the background, Karen seethed. Her image, once triumphant and indignant, was now tarnished. Her SUV became less a symbol of victimhood and more a reminder of carelessness. She tried to rally sympathy at HOA meetings, but the narrative had shifted. People were starting to ask why one person believed they could override the deed and who benefits when boundaries are ignored. The paper war had revealed something fundamental about this kind of conflict. Entitlement could make noise, but it could not rewrite public records. Performance could rile a room, but it could not replace a surveyor's stamp or a recorded deed. In the end, the truth in ink held more power than the loudest accusation. The battle was not over. Legal fights have a way of dragging on, with appeals and motions extending the conflict into months. But for the first time since the SUV first tore through the gate, I felt the momentum shift from reactive defense to proactive control. The trap in the gravel had been only the beginning.
The documents, the footage, and the surveyor's map were now the hooks that would keep the HOA's narrative from reasserting itself. And as the county prepared for the next round of hearings,
a different kind of silence settled over the ranch, one born not of calm, but of calculation. The paper battles had slowed Karen and her HOA allies, but they had not silenced them. If anything, the setback only sharpened their determination. When the county refused to rubber stamp their claims and the surveyor's plat made their arguments look thin, they shifted tactics. If they could not win in the courthouse, they would try to win in the court of public opinion. That was when the smear campaign began. It started quietly. Subtle posts in neighborhood forums, whispers at community gatherings, sideways remarks in the local grocery store. Words like dangerous, unstable, and aggressive began to stick to my name, repeated enough times to take on a life of their own. The story twisted from one entitled woman trespassing into a narrative where I was the villain, a reclusive rancher setting deadly traps and terrorizing an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Karen led the charge with the same energy she had poured into everything else. She framed herself as a mother worried for the safety of children, a community member standing up for access, a victim of intimidation. Her SUV, still sitting wounded in her driveway, became a centerpiece of this performance. Each dent and flat tire was paraded as proof of my supposed cruelty. She let the weeds grow around it, let the paint fade in the sun, until it resembled a monument of injustice more than a broken car. Neighbors gathered around it like pilgrims, shaking their heads and muttering their disapproval, feeding the fire she had lit. The HOA board amplified her narrative. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, each one dripping with exaggerated claims. They accused me of endangering residents, of denying safe access to community members, and even of creating hazards that could cause serious injury or death. None of it mentioned the signs, the chains, the repeated trespass. None of it acknowledged the reality of private property. Instead, it painted me as a menace whose land ownership was a threat to everyone around. But their campaign didn't stop at words. They turned to intimidation. Trucks I didn't recognize began to idle near my gate late at night, their headlights cutting across the gravel before disappearing back into the subdivision. Empty beer cans and litter appeared in my ditch, tossed from passing cars. Someone spray-painted "selfish" on a fence post near the road, a crude accusation left like graffiti on a monument. Each act was small enough to be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern, an attempt to wear me down through nuisance and fear. At first, I considered ignoring it. People like Karen thrived on reactions, and silence could sometimes be stronger than argument. But the problem with silence was that it allowed lies to fester unchecked. Left unchallenged, falsehoods could harden into belief, and belief could sway both neighbors and officials. If Karen wanted a public fight, then I would give her one, not through tantrums and exaggerations, but through facts, allies, and exposure. I reached out to the local paper, not with outrage but with documentation. The reporter listened, flipping through photos of tire tracks, broken locks, and trespass caught on camera. The footage of Karen's SUV hitting the trench and tearing its tires was undeniable. It showed the truth without commentary, a silent film of arrogance meeting consequence. When the article ran, it did not frame me as a villain. Instead, it posed the question, when does entitlement cross the line into trespass, and who really was the victim? The shift was subtle at first, but noticeable. Some neighbors began to murmur that maybe the HOA had gone too far. Maybe Karen wasn't as innocent as she claimed. The narrative fractured. People who had once been quick to side with the subdivision's board began to step back, unwilling to attach themselves to a story unraveling under scrutiny. But Karen wasn't finished. She doubled down, her anger turning desperate. She lobbied the HOA to fund a lawsuit against me personally, pressing them to pour resources into a legal fight they couldn't win. She staged photo ops near my gate, bringing along sympathetic residents to stand in front of the locked posts as if they were protesters at some great injustice. She filmed videos of herself speaking into her phone, lamenting the danger she had endured, sharing them online where they spread among sympathetic circles. And yet, for all her efforts, cracks were showing. The HOA's legal bills mounted, and whispers began circulating about dues being raised to cover costs. Residents grumbled about money being spent on a fight most admitted privately was unwinnable. Some started attending board meetings not to cheer Karen on, but to question why their association was entangled. In a feud over a road they had never used until she discovered it, the smear campaign that had been meant to isolate me began to backfire, slowly but surely. Each attempt to portray me as unstable was countered with calm evidence. Each exaggerated claim was answered with a measured rebuttal. And with each step, Karen's once commanding narrative began to fray at the edges. Still, the harassment didn't stop. She was too invested, too prideful to retreat. Late one night, motion cameras near the gate caught a figure trying to tamper with the posts, rattling the chain as if to test its strength. The footage was grainy, but the outline of the SUV idling nearby was unmistakable. Karen wasn't just fighting with words anymore. She was pushing again, daring me to react, desperate to reclaim control. The battle was reaching its peak. What had started as a shortcut had become a crusade, and now it threatened to erupt into something even larger. Karen had thrown everything at me: lawyers, smear campaigns, intimidation, and yet the truth still stood firm. I knew then that the final act was coming. Karen's pride would never let her stop. She would escalate until she either broke me or broke herself. And with the evidence mounting, with neighbors tiring of her theatrics, and with the county watching closely, the collapse of her campaign was only a matter of time. The trap at the gate had damaged her SUV. But the trap she had set for herself, the lies, the lawsuits, the smear campaigns, was about to crush her far worse. By the time autumn settled in, the battle had reached its breaking point. The leaves along the fence line had turned red and gold. The fields were quiet, with harvest nearly complete, and yet the air in Willow Creek crackled with tension. Months of skirmishes had left scars across both the land and the community. My gate bore the dents of repeated trespass. Karen's SUV sat crippled in her driveway like a cautionary statue, and the HOA meetings had devolved into shouting matches over legal bills and finger-pointing. Everyone knew the feud had to end, but Karen, true to form, was determined to script the ending herself. She was losing ground. The smear campaign had failed to sway the county. The lawsuits had drained the HOA's coffers, and neighbors were turning from allies to skeptics. Still, her pride wouldn't allow her to concede. To her, retreat was worse than defeat. It would mean admitting that she had been wrong all along. And so she planned one last act, one final push to reassert her dominance over my gate, over the road, and over me. The night it happened was calm at first. The moon cast silver shadows across the gravel path, the chill of early frost settling over the fields. My motion cameras flickered to life as headlights cut through the darkness, growing brighter, closer, faster. Karen's SUV, or perhaps one borrowed for this moment, roared toward the locked gate with reckless abandon. This was no cautious trespass like before. It was an outright charge, a deliberate attempt to smash through the barriers once and for all. But what Karen didn't realize was that my preparations had evolved just as her tactics had escalated. After months of damage and harassment, I had fortified the gate with reinforced posts, sunk deep into concrete, braced with steel that could withstand far more than a suburban SUV. And behind the gate, I'd laid another trench, deeper and sharper than before, hidden just beyond the first line of gravel. It wasn't meant to harm her directly. It was designed to stop the vehicle in its tracks, to prove beyond any doubt that this shortcut was closed forever. The cameras captured the moment in stark detail. The SUV barreled forward, its engine howling in defiance. The impact echoed through the night as metal met metal, a thunderous crash that splintered wood but left the steel core unyielding. The vehicle shuddered violently, airbags detonating in a bloom of white before lurching forward into the trench. Its front wheels plunged, its undercarriage scraping and groaning as momentum died in a screech of bending steel. When the dust settled, the once proud machine sat crippled, its nose buried, its wheels spinning helplessly in the air. Karen stumbled out, shaken but uninjured, her face pale in the cold moonlight. Neighbors, roused by the sound, gathered at a distance, their murmurs carrying through the still air. Some raised their phones, recording, documenting, ensuring that this moment would not vanish into rumor. For the first time, the performance was no longer hers to control. She had written the script, but the ending belonged to the truth. The sheriff arrived minutes later, lights flashing across the fields. This time, there was no lecture about neighborly disputes or civil disagreements. This time, there was evidence so plain, so undeniable, that even the most stubborn official could not ignore it. Trespass, destruction of property, reckless endangerment, all of it played out in living color on camera, backed by the testimony of witnesses who had grown weary of Karen's crusade. The HOA scrambled to distance themselves, insisting they had not sanctioned this latest stunt, that Karen had acted on her own. But their earlier support, their willingness to indulge her campaign, had already tied them to her reputation. Residents demanded answers about dues wasted on lawsuits and smear campaigns, about why their community had been dragged into a feud that should never have left one woman's driveway. The board fractured, members resigning under pressure, meetings devolving into chaos as factions pointed fingers at one another. The association that had once stood behind Karen crumbled in the fallout of her final act. Karen herself faced consequences she could not spin away. Insurance refused to cover the damage, citing her reckless trespass. Fines and charges piled up, small at first but relentless, each one a reminder that her pride had real-world costs. Her reputation, once cloaked in the guise of concerned neighbor, was shredded beyond repair. People who had once rallied to her cause avoided her, unwilling to be pulled into the spiral she had created. She was left alone, the very isolation she had tried to force on me now surrounding her like a cage. For me, the conclusion was not triumphant, but resolute. The trap at the gate had done its job, not out of malice but out of necessity. It had stopped the trespass, proven the truth, and ended the cycle of harassment that had consumed so much of my time and peace. My land remained mine, my gate unbroken, my right to privacy affirmed. Yet the victory carried a weight. The fight had scarred the community, strained relationships, and revealed how quickly pride could turn neighbor against neighbor. In the weeks that followed, I repaired the gate one final time, reinforcing it not just as a barrier of steel and wood, but as a symbol of boundaries that could no longer be ignored. The trench was filled, the cameras remained, and the signs stood tall. But the greatest deterrent was no longer the physical defenses. It was the memory of what had happened, the story etched into the community's collective mind. No one, not even the boldest, dared challenge the gate again. As for Karen, she faded into the background. Her SUV sat rusting in the same spot until eventually it was towed away, a relic of her downfall. She stopped appearing at meetings, stopped posting in forums, stopped pushing her narrative. Whether out of shame, exhaustion, or sheer defeat, she vanished from the spotlight she had once craved. The silence she left behind was almost eerie, a void where her constant presence had once been. Looking back, the feud had been about more than a gate. It was about entitlement, about respect, about the lengths to which someone would go to assert control over something that was never theirs. Karen's downfall was not the result of my trap alone. It was the result of her own refusal to accept boundaries, her inability to back down even when reason demanded it. The trap had merely revealed the truth she had tried so hard to bury, that pride unchecked can destroy not just one person, but the community around them. And so the chapter closed. The ranch stood quiet again, the fields peaceful, the gate secure. The cameras still hummed softly at night. But more often than not, they recorded nothing but deer crossing the gravel or the wind rustling the trees. Life moved on as it always does, leaving behind the wreckage of Karen's pride as a lesson etched in steel and soil. The trap had caught her SUV, yes, but in the end, it had caught something else, something deeper. It had caught the arrogance that had driven her, pinned it down, and left it exposed for all to see. And in that final reckoning, it wasn't my ranch that was damaged. It was Karen's empire of entitlement that lay in ruins, never to rise again.